want to welcome you to our next in a series, our speaker series. This is actually our first post-COVID, if we can say that, a speaker series event with Dr. Gerald Sitter. Some of you have found us on the website. You've tuned in to Zoom calls. We've had conversations with Makoto Fujimura, with James K. Smith, with Justin Giboney with the AND campaign. We're looking forward to another live event with James K. Smith in January of 2022, as well as Andy Crouch in April of 2022. But tonight we're spending our time looking forward at the next 5 to 15 years of church planting in the Bay Area. Why do I say that? Well, a lot of us often feel like we are placed under the pressure of our denomination, our sending agency. There's a particular way of looking at church planting that does not always work in a secularizing post-Christian society. So as we are leaving Christendom and becoming post-Christian, I think we find a way forward looking at the church in pre-Christian reality, the church as it was emerging in the 1st and 2nd century. And personally, I've done a lot of reading on this topic, and I'm not sure I have read a book that I've resonated as deeply with as I have Dr. Sitser's Resilient Faith. Just a quick word about Jerry before I introduce him to you. Several years back, right as I was getting married, my wife's mother died unexpectedly 5 weeks after our wedding ceremony, and we were given probably 15 or 20 different books on grief. And some of them were okay, some of them were decent, but by far the best book we read was a book entitled A Grace Disguised, as Dr. Sittser told the story of losing his mother, his wife, his daughter in a tragic car accident. But more than telling the story, really gave us language for dealing with our own grief and finding grace in the midst of that journey. So that was my first introduction to Jerry Sitter, and then as I mentioned, I devoured Resilient Faith last year, and some of the lessons that I drew from that book, I think, are vital, as I said, to the next 5 to 15 years of church planting in the Bay Area. So Jerry has graciously agreed to speak with us. He'll probably talk for 30 or 40 minutes, and then I'll join Jerry on stage for a conversation, and you can text your questions in to that conversation as well. Jerry is currently the professor emeritus at Whitworth University, where he spent around 25 years, 30 years on faculty. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Gerald Sitter.
Thanks, Bart. Appreciate that very much. I want to begin by talking about the obvious. My kids accuse me that I talk about the obvious all the time. And that is something is happening in America that is changing our landscape dramatically, especially religiously. This past summer, I participated in a Zoom conference, and all the people participating were speakers, and now they're marketing it. It was funded by a Templeton grant, and they had 14 scholars present papers. And little did I know that these scholars represented some of the great research institutions around the world. I was kind of the little guy in the group, coming only from Whitworth University. But there was a fascinating conference and a fascinating group of people, and really lovely people. The theme was the reasons for de-identification, sociological term that talks about why people are dropping out of faith and dropping out of the church. And sociologists measure this according to loss of belief system. They don't believe in God anymore. A loss or declining membership and declining participation. So belief, membership, and participation. And I was the only historian in the group. All the rest were social scientists. And it was pretty obvious to me as I was listening to them that they were describing a change of landscape that is so dramatic to them in such a short period of time, they simply didn't know what to say about it. I mean, it was almost humorous to watch them fumble for words, thinking, we don't even know how to analyze this statistically because it's been so dramatic in such a short period of time. And the tools that these folks are using now are very sophisticated, very precise. So the measurement they were dealing with was 1999 to 2019, 20-year period of time. And they talk, for example, about loss of membership. Their research engines have demonstrated that membership has declined in 20 years from 70% down to 49%. Now, if it were 5%, we'd say, wow, that's significant. 70% down to 49% in the United States. From 1999 to 2019, the drop in religious services, attendance at religious services has been 40 down to about 26 to 27%. Again, that's a precipitous decline. The number of people who don't believe in God has grown in America in the last 20, 25 years from 7% to about 26%. And the other thing that's notable, wouldn't be a surprise to you folks at all, is that the younger you go, the higher the rates of unbelief. So the Great Generation, very high, and then Silent Generation, and then Boomers all the way down. And as you go down the chain of age, you go up when it comes to levels of unbelief, less participation, and membership and the like. Okay, so that was the bad news. And again, they scratched their heads saying, we don't even know what to make of all of this. It's so dramatic. But then one of the researchers, a man by the name of Tyler Vanderweel, he teaches at Harvard. By the way, he just published an article, the cover story, I believe, in Christianity Today, which is coming out next month. And it's some of his research findings. He is, among other things, the director of human flourishing, the study of human flourishing at Harvard, and a lovely Christian man. And he said, here's the greater puzzle. When sociologists use their techniques of research to study the impact of religion, especially when you're serious about religious belief, you're not, say, a Christian nationalist, and you're regular in your attendance at worship and other things, you see this pattern of positive impact anywhere you look. In fact, they have 15 different measurements, and in every one of them, if you were a regular church attender, you are going to live a healthier life. Rates of divorce are lower, recovery from sickness is much higher, rates of depression and anxiety, suicide rates. I mean, every statistical measurement they used indicated a very positive impact for people who show high rates of religious participation. So he said, what do we do with this? Decline on the one hand and positive effects of religion on the other. We're hearing a lot about this. We're not hearing a lot about that. Now, he qualified himself right away to say, look, people shouldn't believe in God because they're going to live longer or their marriages are going to be happier. That's not the point. We do it because we follow Jesus. But if we are serious about following Jesus and are anchored in a church, chances are, on all scales of measurement, we're going to live healthier, happier lives. All right. Now, as we all know, and people that I'm speaking to that are watching this by Zoom or in recording or something like that, we're seeing those significant changes in American religion ourselves. We're experiencing it. We're feeling it. I hang around with a lot of pastors in the present iteration of my life. And almost everybody says, I don't know where 50% of my people are. They're having trouble with higher blood pressure. They're anxious. They're depressed. People are leaving conservative churches for more conservative churches. And younger folks are deciding it's a lot more fun just to stay home on Sunday morning and make pancakes. And all of us are feeling the dysfunction of our society right now. Democracy does not seem to be working as it once did. There's a deep polarization. I lived through the 60s and 70s. I'm 71 years old, and it feels even more severe than it did during the Vietnam Watergate period. Red is getting redder. Blue is getting bluer. Supermajorities are dominating the political landscape across the United States. There are rising rates of mental health problems, and all professionals will tell you that, and the researchers are backing it up with statistics. And as we know, there's a growing disparity between rich and poor, and religion is losing its distinctiveness. If you mention the word evangelical right now, immediately people are going to think of Republican. Now, that's not a political statement, by the way. That's not where I'm going at all with this. What I want to suggest to you is that this is not new in the history of Christianity. Western civilization in particular has gone through a series of very significant crises that would even make this look middle of the road. And what's interesting from an historical point of view is in some of these periods of crisis, something new religiously has emerged that you wouldn't have been able to see at the time of its first occurrence. And it ended up bringing tremendous renewal to the church. Now, this is actually what I'm working on in research right now. So I want to give you a few examples. You're going to notice that in almost all of these movements, there was some kind of return to what I call first principles. It was actually the name of a book that Origen, the great church father, wrote in the 3rd century. Back to basics, back to the kind of original message, back to what makes Christianity what it is. And that surprisingly led to a great deal of innovation. So when you go back to sort of the tradition, it ends up being fresh and innovative at the same time. But again, you wouldn't have noticed it when this first occurred. Now, I have an analogy to give you. Every summer, I would bring my kids backpacking or camping to a national park. It was just a Sittser custom. And one year when my kids were, I don't know, maybe 13, 10, and 6 or something like that, we went to Yellowstone National Park. Now in the 80s, there was a massive forest fire in Yellowstone that consumed something like 400,000 acres. And there are parts of the park that show scars of that unbelievable conflagration that occurred. And this is what it looks like. And we hiked through some of these. We walked through stands of towering timber that were gray like tombstones, all dead. Most of the limbs gone, of course, no foliage at all. And you felt like you were walking through a graveyard of trees, and they were huge trees. So you'd look up and you'd see nothing but deadness around you, the vestiges of a forest that was burned to the ground. But if you take your eyes and move from here down to here, what did you see? New green growth, beautiful. Trees, flowers, all kinds of things that were coming up out of the ashes of that forest fire. Now, when we go through periods of crisis, we tend to mourn what we see up there. And we need to learn to train our eyes at the new things that God is doing down here. But it's not always obvious. So let me give you a couple of examples. As most of you know, the Roman Empire declined. I mean, Gibbon wrote a book on this. And the decline started especially in the 3rd century. It's a century of tremendous instability of emperors. The army was too big. The economy was flat. There was a revival for a little bit in the 4th century, but generally speaking, that decline continued until the empire fell apart. To give you one example, the city of Rome had between 1 million and 1.5 million people in the year 300, just before Constantine came to power. Think about one ancient urban center, 1 million to 1.5 million people. By the year 525, Rome's population was less than 50,000. Now, I don't know what the population of San Francisco is, but do the math. That level of growth or that level of decline is simply breathtaking. The greatest city in the ancient world, at least the Mediterranean world, collapsed. And that was true of all the major cities: Antioch, Alexandria, Ephesus, Carthage, all of them, all declined. Tribal groups were invading the empire and they began to settle. We still understand what their names mean: the Vandals. That tells you something about the tribe. The Goths, Visigoths, Ostrogoths, Lombards, Angles, Saxons, Franks, all of those were tribal groups. And Rome was not able to handle this massive change in the empire, and it declined. Well, most people don't know this. If you would Google worst year in world history, you would find a kind of strange scholarly consensus, and the year would be not 1347 with the Black Death, or something in the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648, not even World War I or World War II. It would be the year 536. Check it out, 536. Well, there was a series of volcanic eruptions in Iceland and in some other parts of the world, and it was massive. And it spit into the atmosphere huge amounts of volcanic ash that encircled the globe. It was called the beginning of the Dark Ages, literally. People at the time called it the year of winter. The summer never warmed up. The sun never appeared in the sky. It snowed in places like Italy in August. Well, you can imagine what that did to food production, which set off a massive famine through much of not the Mediterranean world, but even into the Middle East. Then in 540, just 4 years later, Justinian's plague, he was the emperor at the time, Justinian, erupted. Probably first example of the Black Death or the bubonic plague in Western civilization. Scholars aren't sure how many people died, but it might have been upwards of 25% of the population. Okay, now imagine what this did to that empire and to the church. It was just catastrophic. But at this very same time, there was this little man living outside Rome. He grew up in a fairly aristocratic family, went to Rome for education, became so disillusioned by what he saw there that he withdrew into a wilderness place, lived in a cave for a while, and became a holy man. He began to attract some disciples, and they wanted him to mentor them. His first experiment failed. They actually tried to poison him because he was too demanding. And he escaped and went to another place and began to practice this kind of ascetic lifestyle again. Some other people sought him out, and he decided the best way to solve the problem of demand is more demand. It was counterintuitive. And in order to guide this experiment in this new way of living in community together, he wrote a rule, now known as the Rule of St. Benedict. By the time he died, he had established 12 monasteries, little monasteries, of 12 people each. Okay, now imagine planting in your network 12 churches with 12 people and call that a success. Well, you wouldn't. But this little experiment under Benedict and this rule of life that he developed, then there were others besides that. Augustine wrote a rule of life, Basil of Caesarea. He wasn't the only one, although his legacy was the most lasting. That little experiment in monastic living set in motion the creation of an institution that quite literally saved the church in Western civilization. So you get by the year 800 to 1000, it's the dominant institution in the Western world. All the missionaries in the Middle East or in the Middle Ages were monks. They were the motels of the Middle Ages. They were the pharmacies. They were the hospitals. They were the places that copied books and scriptures. They handed on the classical legacy to us. It all went through monastic libraries. They practiced the art of illumination. They trained people. They dispatched people. You could not live in Europe in the year 1200, any place in Europe, and you would not be more than a day's walk to a monastery. Now, he died, by the way, in 547, right during this catastrophic period. If we had been living in the year 547, we wouldn't have even noticed this. And yet, out of this movement, you could almost make an argument it saved Western civilization. That's one example. Here's another one. You're one of the first Christians. You grew up as a Jew. You speak Aramaic. You practice Torah. You go to the synagogue. And you're a follower of Jesus. you start hearing about some renegade Christians that are breaking into Gentile territory. They're speaking the language of Gentiles. They're beginning to cut back on some of the demands that Torah makes on the followers of Jesus, and you finally attend a council to make decisions about what to do with these Gentile converts. Well, we know that council is the first council in the history of Christianity. The results are recorded in Acts 15. And they made decisions at that council that have had implications that go to this day. Think about this. They did not require a double conversion. You don't have to become a Jew before you become a Christian. Many of the leaders of that movement, when they began to write letters and books in order to spread the gospel message and to build disciples, they wrote it in the language of the target group they were trying to reach. They didn't write in Aramaic, although they were all Hebrew speaking or Aramaic speaking. They wrote it in the language of Greek. Within the first few centuries of the history of Christianity, Christianity was operating in Syriac, Goth, Coptic, Latin, Greek. That trajectory has continued to this day. The entire Bible has been translated into almost 900 languages. The New Testament has been translated into 1,500 more languages, and on it goes. Every once in a while, Christianity gets culturally stuck. Latin, to some degree, English. But entrepreneurs and visionaries, people who return to first principles, to Acts 15, are always breaking out of that straitjacket saying, no, if we're going to be true to the faith, we need to start building bridges culturally between one group and another. Okay, here's just two other brief examples. If we'd been living in the 13th century, we would have begun to see cities grow again. Now, not cities as we would understand them, cities of 5,000 to 10,000 people. We'd see a moribund church. We'd see uneducated priests. We'd see huge monasteries that are off the grid, so to speak. We'd think the church is in trouble here. The cities are growing, and no Christian witness is there. And then in the 13th century, two geniuses who didn't know each other and never met began movements that literally transformed the face of Europe. One was named Dominic, and the other one was named Francis, and they began the Mendicant movement that brought all of the passion and power and discipline of the monastery back to the city and back to lay people. Out of that movement was born all kinds of what we call third order movements, kind of quasi-monastic movements that attracted lay people, like the Third Order Franciscans and Dominicans, the Beguines, later on the Brethren of the Common Life, and that all laid the groundwork for the Reformation movement. Or here's the last one. If we had gone to England in the beginning of the 18th century, we would have seen a profoundly corrupt culture and an even more corrupt crown. It was a real low point in English history. And two brothers, trained at Oxford, growing up in Anglican homes, both had a conversion experience 3 days apart. One of them said that his heart had become strangely warmed. And they believed passionately that the gospel needed to be freshened up and brought to people who were alienated, being members of the working class of England. Now, John and Charles Wesley were maybe modestly talented theologians, but as visionaries and organizers, they were geniuses. John especially was a strategist, and he developed a Methodist movement, for disciple making and leadership training without sending people off to Oxford or Cambridge in order to get educated so they could be worthy clergy. He started bands that fell by the wayside, but the genius of the movement was the development of a class system, not class as we understand it today, better called small group. 12 people, strict accountability, Bible memorization, so on and so forth. The people who were leading these groups would become trained, and they became the future church planners in the movement. Then on Wednesday or Thursday night, they would gather in larger groups in order to hear the exposition of the Word of God and sing the hymns that Charles wrote that couldn't be sung on Sunday morning in Anglican churches. Charles was the poet of the movement. John was the organizer of the movement. By the time they died, and by the way, they both died Anglicans, not Methodists. They used the Book of Common Prayer till the day they died. One died in 1788, the other one in 1891. There were over 1 million people that were participating in these small groups, and the movement had spread, everywhere, including to the United States, where it first became an independent movement, the Methodist movement. Now, that grew a little bit more quickly, but it was institutionally kind of underdeveloped. They didn't have church property. They couldn't do anything in Anglican churches. And yet, there are historians that say England was spared its own French Revolution because of the Methodist movement. What I'm saying is that history has faced dark hours. And some entrepreneur or visionary, or many of them actually, have launched new movements that return to first principles. Go and make disciples. And if we had been alive when these movements began, we would not have noticed them. They grew slowly, but they had huge impact. Well, I've written a book about this, Resilient Faith. I became fascinated by early Christianity, not so much theologically. I became more fascinated by it as a movement. So I received what I call a Christendom theological education. I went to seminary back in the 70s. When we studied early Christianity, we studied orthodoxy and heresies. When we studied the Middle Ages, we studied why the church failed. We didn't pay much attention to all the great things about the Middle Ages, like monasteries or universities. It was mostly bad Catholicism. We studied the Reformation, and in my tradition, pretty much the hat got tipped toward the Reformation wing of the Reformation. We studied evangelical awakenings, and then we studied the battle between orthodoxy and liberalism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, that's an oversimplification. But generally speaking, I studied a history of Christianity that was really a summation of a family argument. It was all about how we functioned in Christendom. All right, so fast forward several decades, and I'm reading an early Christianity, and I'm reading a document that was written about the year 140. The author is unknown, but we know who the recipient of the document was. And by the way, it's one of the first, I think the first, apologetic work we have that still has survived to this day. It's still extant. It's called the so-called letter to Diognetus. Diognetus is a recipient. He was probably a court official in Rome or in some other important city. And this unknown author, in his introduction, talks about Christianity being or producing a third race. I call it the third way. The third race. Now, that's a curious phrase to use. Of course, it makes you immediately want to ask, well, what's the first and the second? It's obvious in this apologetic work, very short, by the way, and very elegantly written. It's a beautiful document. The first was the Roman race. That is traditional Roman religion. Roman religion was ubiquitous around the Mediterranean world. I mean, it was simply a part of the air you breathe. Temples, monuments, shrines, festivals, feasts. Every city had an acropolis with temples that were devoted to the gods and to the emperors. You simply bumped into it all day long. Most homes had little gods and goddesses and shrines. Scholars call it a transactional religion. You did something for the gods so that they would do something for you. Any kind of notion of a personal faith or of a theology, even an ethical way of life, It was unknown in Roman religion. That was what philosophers did, not what religion did. That was the first race, and by far the most dominant. The second race, curiously, was the Jewish race. Jews were highly respected in the Roman world, and there were a lot of them. Scholars estimate maybe up to 10% of the Roman world was Jewish. Diaspora Jews in Rome and Corinth and Alexandria, all over the empire. They were actually given special benefits. They didn't have to serve in the army. They didn't have to pay special taxes. Because their religion was ancient and highly ethical, it was honored. But Jews were isolated because of their kosher laws and way of life. So while Rome represented the way of accommodation, Jews represented the way of isolation, respected but distant from the culture. And then, as this author says to Diognetus, there's this third race. And Diognetus was familiar with the term because he knew enough about Christianity to know that it was really new and really unusual. Well, this document begins by describing not Christian belief, as we probably would, but Christian behavior. Because Diognetus had seen evidence of how Christians lived in the ancient world. And it was impressive to him. And he wanted to know why. So now I'm going to quote from the document. The rule is, by the way, you should never do long quotes, and I'm going to break it right now because this is so beautifully written. This is what the author says to Diognetus. For Christians cannot be distinguished from the rest of the human race by country or language or customs. In other words, they talk like everybody else, they dress like everybody else, and they eat like everybody else. They shop in the same marketplaces. They do not live in cities of their own. They do not use a peculiar form of speech. They do not follow an eccentric manner of life. If you're walking down the street, you wouldn't be able to spot them. It's not like they're all wearing red hats or they're all doing some kind of weird genuflecting that's obvious to people. They're just ordinary folk. This doctrine of theirs has not been discovered by the ingenuity or deep thought of inquisitive men, that is, the philosophers, nor do they put forward a merely human teaching as some people do. Now listen to this. It's so well written. Yet, although they live in Greek and barbarian cities alike, as each man's lot has been cast, and follow the customs of the country in clothing and food and other matters of daily living, at the same time, they give proof, notice the word proof, evidence, of the remarkable and admittedly extraordinary constitution of their own commonwealth. Oikoumene is the Greek term. And Rome considered itself the primary commonwealth in the ancient world. Rome was chest thumping. It was the main player. And Christians began to call themselves a new commonwealth, a new universal kingdom. I mean, it was kind of a joke to Rome. I mean, where's your army? It's like they just didn't present themselves as empires normally do. No bullying, no power, no showing off. They didn't have any big buildings. They weren't writing fancy books. And yet they were creeping forward with influence. And it was rattling Rome. Just an interesting side note, by the late 2nd century, an elite Roman philosopher is writing a book against Christianity. Well, that would be like a Harvard professor writing a book against a community college in Bismarck, North Dakota. I mean, honestly, why bother? It's too small, it's too weak, it's too insignificant. But he sniffed something in the air, and he was nervous. They were different. It's like a bunch of athletes that want to play football players in chess. What are they going to do? They can't play the game their normal way. And that's exactly what happened in this set of circumstances. They live in their own countries, but only as aliens. They have a share in everything as citizens and endure everything as foreigners. every foreign land is their fatherland. In other words, they're Americans, they're Chinese, they're French, they eat French food, they love French culture. And yet for them, every fatherland is a foreign land. It's one of the greatest lines ever written in Christian literature right there. Every foreign land is their fatherland, and yet for them, every fatherland is a foreign land. They learn how to adapt culturally without being absorbed. They learned how to adapt culturally without being absorbed, and Rome was very absorptive. So a 3rd century philosopher, another elite kind of Harvard philosopher of the 3rd century, Porphyry, actually writes, "We would love to welcome Jesus into the pantheon of the Roman gods." Now this seemed to him like a gesture of such unbelievable generosity. But Christians wouldn't do it, for obvious reasons. He continues, "They busy themselves on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. And don't think heaven like the Middle Ages thought of it. It better put the kingdom of God, the rule of God over all of life. They obey the established laws, but in their own lives, they go beyond what the law requires." So instead of paying just taxes, they give more. Then he explains the belief system. He said, now these behaviors that you've observed that are so noticeable to somebody like yourself, there's a reason why Christians live this way. They live this way because of how they believe. They're following Jesus Christ. And when you think about how humans have developed religions, if anyone ever imagines an incarnation, it would be as an Augustus or as a Socrates or as an Alexander the Great or as a Hercules. Who would invent Jesus? It's just a stupid idea, unless it's true. Born in Nazareth, never goes far from home, leaves nothing in print, no army, nothing. I mean, there's nothing about this man's earthly life that would be worthy of honor. He wouldn't even be a footnote in a history textbook, except what happened afterwards. And that figure of Jesus, who becomes to Christians not only the way to life, but also the way of life. And as a way of life, it set off a movement that eventually transformed the Roman world. Now, there's a lot we don't know about the first 300 years, and it was no golden age. There is no golden age in the history of Christianity. I mean, who'd want to be a pastor of the church in Corinth during the apostolic period, right? We look at the apostolic period as sort of pure Christianity. Well, that's utter nonsense. It wasn't. I mean, Corinth would make all of your churches look like healthy churches in comparison. And it's true in the early Christian period, too. They could be uncharitable with enemies. It's really scandalous to see how quickly they turned on the Jews, for example. So there are dark sides to this history. But in the main, there are some things we can learn. How is it possible that this movement, which numbered, 5,000 people in the year 40, became a movement that comprised 5 million people on the eve of the last great persecution of the church? Rodney Stark calls this a growth rate of about 40% per decade for almost 300 years. Now that seems a lot, but 40% per decade is really not all that much. I mean, mega churches in America right now would call that an abysmal failure. But they grew it slow and steady and sure. And one reason why it could be a tall building is because they learned how to build a really sturdy and big foundation. Well, the whole story changed, of course, after the emergence of Christendom, and that's for another time. I want to focus especially on that early Christian period. And what I want to suggest to you is, among other things, they developed a process by which to form people in the faith. Now think about the book of Acts. Everybody who comes to faith in the book of Acts is baptized immediately. And the reason why is because they're either Jews or they were what were called God-fearers, or fellow traveling Jews, Gentiles that wouldn't want to submit to circumcision but admired Jews and followed their way of life. The only exception would be maybe the Philippian jailer, but we don't know enough about him to say. But think about the Ethiopian eunuch. He was reading a book in his chariot, and it wasn't Socrates. It was the book of Isaiah. There was familiarity, in other words, with many of the worldview categories in the story that Christianity fulfilled according to early Christian preaching. Well, in that case, it was a step, even a big step, but not 10 steps, one step, to be able to recognize, oh, yes, Jesus is a fulfillment of this story, and to trust in him and submit to his way of life. But as Christianity worked itself into the Roman world, imagine what it must have been like to do ministry in that population. Now, they weren't just non-Christian. Their whole way of life, their whole view of religion was different. They didn't know any of the story. Adam, who's he? Eve, Abraham, Moses, Esther, Ruth. They didn't know anything. But they didn't know the categories. They didn't understand sin or the reasonable demands that a gracious God puts on people or a Christian community. They knew nothing. And imagine trying to introduce them to the Christian faith. Well, no wonder why immediate baptism stopped by sometime in the 2nd century. You'd be baptizing them into something they didn't understand, into nothing. So they developed what I call a long on-ramp, a period of training to introduce them to not only the belief of Christianity, but what it meant to belong and what it meant to behave. And that actually occurred before baptism, or what by the 2nd century they called the rites of initiation. That is, baptism, confirmation, first Eucharist, all that took place during what we call the Pascha. Eventually it became Holy Week, Good Friday to Easter Sunday. And these became very elaborate rituals. I mean, some of us think, oh my gosh, there's Catholicism again. But the rituals were meaningful because the process was culturally demanding. I mean, it's a little like the elaborate graduation ceremony at West Point. Well, it better be elaborate just to get through West Point. Well, this is kind of what occurred in the early Christian period with these rites of initiation. There was a long on-ramp that led them into the heart and life of Christianity. They called that the catechumenate. It was a formation process, and it took, hold your breath here, because people almost are offended by this, 2 to 3 years. And when I explain this to people, everybody says, oh my gosh, that's so legalistic. No, it was creating a culture of discipleship. Now I'm going to give you an analogy of this. My son was a runner in high school, and he was on as I've said to Bart, on a very, very good team. Going in his senior year, he was team captain. They were ranked #1 in the country by Sports Illustrated. Very good. If you would have gone to their coaches and said, tell me about your team rules, they would have said, what team rules? They had developed a culture of excellence. It was not imposed. It was not strict. They didn't shame kids, especially freshmen and sophomores, that would kind of show up and then not show up and work half-hearted. They developed a team culture that led them to excellence. Let me give you a couple of examples. They had a morning run. No coaches. Seniors and juniors would just go around and pick up freshmen and sophomores and say, we're just going to have kind of a fun little run, and then all have breakfast together. My son did that for 4 years. It wasn't an official team activity at all. It was seniors mentoring underclassmen in the team. Here's another one. When they ever got done running, the best runners would immediately circle back and jog down the course to cheer on the slowest runners on the team. A team culture of excellence, of mutual support. That's what they did for the most part in early Christianity. They developed a culture of discipleship, a culture of formation. Now, why I'm interested in this is really simple. I believe we're entering what I'd call a post-Christendom phase of Western history. I don't call it post-Christian yet. I mean, it probably is post-Christian, but a lot of people claim to be Christian who are really Democrats or Republicans instead, or capitalists. So we still have the veneer of Christianity, and we still use the language. When it comes, though, to authentic practice, it's fading, and it's fading fast, as these sociological reports are giving us more and more. And in places like the Bay Area or Seattle, Portland, even Spokane, our church attendance on any given Sunday is under 15% now. By the way, the most secular city in the United States is in Portland. It's Portland, Maine. So the Northeast is like that too. In this environment of post-Christendom, I think we have a lot to learn from the Christian movement in pre-Christendom. Now, they actually had some advantages we don't have. They didn't have to explain all those weird Christians out there. They didn't have to say, no, not all of us are card-carrying Democrats or Republicans, or not all of us believe in prosperity gospel, or whatever. That was an advantage. But we also have some advantages. We have some strong institutions we can still rely on. We've got property. We've got a lot of wealth. We have some things that can work to our advantage if we learn how to steward them differently. All I want to say is there's a lot to learn here, and I would suggest that at the heart of it was this culture of formation that they developed. And I would suggest we're going to have to come up with something like that again that's going to be more than a weekend new members class. I don't think it's sufficient anymore. And we can do it in a way that's gentle and welcoming and grace-filled and not legalistic. For example, you can't find tithe in early Christianity. That can't be a marker of what it means to be a serious Christian. Do you tithe? I don't care. You should tithe your whole life and then figure out what that means in terms of money and time and resources and your gifts and so on and so forth. So a culture of formation, a culture of discipleship feels much more grace-filled to me than one that just has a list of 10 things that makes you a good member. That's Phariseeism, that's not Christianity. So I'm going to conclude my comments with that.
Well, welcome back. This is the second installment of our evening together with Dr. Gerald Sitter. And I have about 20 questions, but I'm going to limit them to 2 or 3 and then take questions from the audience. Firstly, Jerry, you touched on this right at the end, but give us the thumbnail again for how you would define Christendom and post-Christendom, because I think that's important for us as we think about the future.
Christendom, I define loosely as the symbiotic relationship between Christianity and culture, church and state. Now, that didn't mean that those entities always got along, but it meant that the culture at large thought of itself as a Christian culture. So the set of assumptions by which it was guided was always informed by this sense that pretty much if you live in the West, you are Christian. In the Middle East, you're Muslim. In the Far East, you're Hindu or Buddhist. And in the West, you're Christian. But I don't think it was simply an assumption. I do think there was a reality behind it. If you and I were doing polling work in Europe, of course, by now Africa is not part of it, the story at all anymore, but except Coptics and so on. If we had been doing polling in the year 1200 or the year 1600 and asked 1,000 people, are you Christian? 997 would have said yes. Now, what they knew about it, how they practiced it, who knows? But they were self-identified as Christian. All people holding public office, back then it was all kings and rulers, or barons or dukes or whatever, they all would have said they were Christian. I mean, they all had their own chapels. In many cases, they paid their priests or monks to be able to conduct religious affairs. I mean, even to this day, you go to large estates in England, and you'll find all the big states have chapels in them. So that was a symbiotic relationship between Christianity and culture, church and state. And that partnership is breaking down. And where it's not breaking down, it's actually becoming more dangerous. That is a strong identification between religion and a political entity. In my mind, I tell my students this all the time, once the state gets involved in religion, it's always bad for religion. And in the end, it will always be bad for the state too.
Right, okay. So I looked ahead on my phone at some of the questions that were texted. A lot of them deal with the catechumenate, discipleship formation, so I want to get to those things.
Yeah.
Harkening back to where you started your talk, though, talk a bit, you talked about beauty, innovation, things that emerged from crisis, and walked us through several. Monastic movement, mendicant movement, just these...
Wesleyan, Methodist movement.
Right, all of these things that you look back at history now and you see, oh wow, in a really dark space, God used to birth something beautiful. Speculate for a second. You touched on it at the end. There are things we have working for us as we think about being ambassadors of the gospel in this next era, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Some things working against us. But do you speculate what might God be birthing that is beautiful in the midst of what...
I mean, Bart, I wish I knew. Anything I say is probably going to be wrong anyway. I have some senses to me. I know that on the conservative side of the Christian movement, there's a big emphasis on, say, Christian schools, homeschooling. I'm actually sympathetic with all of that, but I'm not a great proponent of it. I think disciple making means we're going to be sending our kids into public schools. And because much of the emphasis on homeschooling in Christian schools, and I mean my first wife was a homeschooler, and I sent my kids to Christian school through elementary school because I thought that nurturing environment they needed in the wake of the loss of their mother and so on. But ultimately, we need to learn how to mentor our children and the next generation so that they can function as lawyers and doctors and teachers and truck drivers and everything else as real citizens of the kingdom in a society where it's really hard to be Christian. Because if we don't do that, we're cultivating a habit of isolation. And that isolation is going to deprive us of the capacity, the skills we need to relate to people who are very different from ourselves and learn to be witnesses to Christ in that kind of environment. So a lot of those more conservative movements, I think they hold some promise. I'm not going to put a lot of my money there. I'm not going to put a lot of my money in mega churches. I think that they're going to become more and more the victim of their own consumer orientation. And that mega pastors I know, good people by the way, they're all not crazy. A lot of them are just, they love Christ and they're really gifted and they've got dynamic personalities and they grow big churches. But what I'm noticing is how hard they're having to work. They have to work harder every year than the year before just to keep people there. And I wonder how long they're going to be able to sustain that, or whether we're going to run out of techniques and creative ideas, whether Hillsong or whatever it is finally just going to run dry and we're not going to be able to pull off that kind of consumer orientation in our ministry. So I'm actually favoring smaller churches, neighborhood churches, churches that work a community, pastors and people who are using coffee shops and restaurants and getting to know people so that our influence is more pervasive and grassroots and less kind of big and glittery.
Yeah, that's good.
So I'm hopeful of that.
Yeah.
Several of my kids are in smaller churches, and I'm liking what I'm seeing there.
Turning our attention for a moment, then I do want to get to some of the audience questions. Turning our attention to the book, Resilient Faith. I love this book, as I mentioned in the introduction. However,
I love you for loving this book.
However, I had one concern as I was reading it, and then it emerged again as I was listening to your talk tonight. And as you described, first race, second race, third race in the letter of Diognetus, which you refer to as the third way, Roman, Jewish, Christian, the Roman culture being a culture of accommodation, Jewish culture being a culture of isolation. And it seems like as you are using that prescriptively for us to think about being a third way, much as the first Christians did, the one concern I held as I read and as I listened, I feel as if there is not as much of an accommodationist tendency, at least in America. I can't speak for the rest of the world. But so my concern is there's almost so much dogma that we are up against with respect to secularity that I'm just not sure, and I don't want to be pessimistic, I want to be hopeful, but I'm not sure that this new third way is going to hold court like it may have in the first, second, and third century.
No, it probably won't.
Yeah.
But again, think about what it was like to be a Christian in the year 100 or 150, when Christians were hardly producing an intellectual class, when they had no buildings. I just got back from Turkey, and leading a tour, and you find no material evidence of Christianity in the first 300 years of its history. It's simply not there. Few art objects, a few mosaics, that's it. No buildings, nothing. That's all later, post-Constantine. So if we had been living way back, we would not have been very confident the Christian movement was going to gradually, I don't want to use the word triumph, that's too triumphalistic, but continue to grow and flourish and exercise greater influence on the culture, as was proven to be the case. I think there's a tremendous amount of accommodation right now. Think about Christian nationalism. That's accommodation. That's bending Christianity to a political agenda. Or how about prosperity gospel? Or just consumer Christianity. We're marketing ourselves. We're creating a brand instead of building functional disciples, what I call improvisational disciples, who know how to be followers of Jesus in ordinary life. So I see a lot of evidence of accommodation, an over accommodation to cultural norms and movements and so on, in order to keep our foot in the door.
Yeah, so quick piggyback on that question, then I have one more, and then we'll get to the audience questions. I experience what you're describing with accommodation from a Christian's perspective, prosperity gospel, American Christian nationalism, but being left coastal, as both of us are. What I mean is there seems to be such a thick dogma around science that makes no mention or accommodation for faith, around politics that seems to disparage faith. And that's the concern I have, is that it felt like there was a syncretistic moment in Roman culture, perhaps, where Christians maybe for a moment at least had a little cachet, or at least there was room to write a letter about them. And sometimes in my least hopeful moments, I feel like, oh no, I'm not even sure if broader American post-Christendom or post-Christian, if we are, culture could even accommodate a hearing.
Yeah, I mean, but look at Celsus's book. We have almost all of it. This later second century Roman elite philosopher who educated emperors. I mean, he was very high ranking, and he wrote this book, and he skewered the Christian movement. He said they were stupid. It was attracting children and old women and stupid people. And said they were too quick to believe the latest nonsense that happened to come out of Galilee, And he mocked the incarnation. He said, who could ever believe something as stupid as that? He thought the resurrection was utterly silly. How can a person who's been dead for 3 days have all of his cells come back together and come to life? He didn't understand what it all meant, but he heaped shame on it as an example of a low-level movement that was only attracting the most stupid of people.
Yeah.
So there's the other side of things.
That's right. Okay, so before I get to audience questions, a lot of people watching are struggling under the matrix of metrics that their church planting, sending agency, denomination puts on them. They have to perform, they've got to meet their numbers, there are particular strings attached to funding. And so you're calling us into a new catechumenate, a formation that might take 2 years, 3 years, deals with belief, deals with belonging, deals with behavior. I think most of us watching are finding our hearts strangely warmed, like Wesley, because that feels like the discipleship we want to do. And then we immediately feel like, I don't have time to do that. I gotta be true to my syllabus, and I gotta let my funders know that.
I hear this. I even hear this, Bart, from pastors who've been at a church for 20 years, older churches. You don't understand my world. You don't understand my people. If I host something that requires 6 weeks, no one's going to show. So I understand how much the odds are stacked against us. All I can say is start slow and let it slowly grow. I don't know what the other alternative is, though. I mean, I'm not sure there is an alternative. So you get a church and it becomes a big box church in 6 years or 8 years, and then you spend the next 25 years trying to maintain that kind of pace or those metrics when you recognize that the commitment level on the part of people is really thin. And a lot of it depends on you just hiring more staff. I mean, what we do is we create a fragile church culture. Now, I'm an academic. It's easy for me to say this stuff. I'm not a pastor who has boots on the ground, although I hang around with a lot of pastors, and I know it's really hard to do. But I'm not sure there's an alternative anymore. I mean, during Christendom, you didn't have to build disciples, and you'd still have everybody believing. Maybe pretty superficial, but you had a lot of state support and cultural sanction to what you were doing. I don't think it's true anymore. So that we have to do something to begin nurturing what I call improvisational disciples, people who understand and live the Christian faith with enough depth that they can get out on a soccer field and know what to do all the time. I mean, I'm mixing metaphors here.
Sure, I get it, that's where a lot of these questions are. So here's the long list. First question that came through. What are some practices that everyday people should embrace or reject in becoming resilient disciples?
Well, I mean, I think there are a lot of ancient practices that should probably be recycled again. Let me give you a couple of examples of that. The Didache, one of the earliest Christian post-apostolic documents we have, we don't know when it was written, about 100, is the first manual that we know of in the history of Christianity, and it prescribes that Christians say the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day. So my wife and I are not doing it 3 times a day, but we're starting to do this. One of the practices we follow is every morning and every night I recite a psalm, because I've memorized a lot of them, and we say the Lord's Prayer. And what that does is that makes a kind of practice much more regular, like shooting free throws or practicing scales as a pianist. It gets old, but you can't advance as a pianist if you don't know all your scales or if you don't know how to shoot free throws. In the case of basketball. So by the time we get into the early 2nd century, close to the beginning of Christianity, they're already practicing prayer 5 times a day. Very short, but it creates this kind of rhythm, a rhythm that's so healthy, like an exercise routine or whatever it happens to be. So some of those ancient practices, I encourage people, because I developed a new catechumenate, I encourage people to write a rule of life, not rules, but a rule that describes a way of life, a pattern of life that is Jesus-oriented in everything they do. And then there are a lot of little things. I mean, obviously, like the Psalms, the Lord's Prayer, regular worship, and so on and so forth. I like the practice of learning to pray God into my life at the beginning of each day. So what it does is it stirs my imagination. Okay, so this morning, not to sound too pious, I'll give you a concrete example, though. This morning, I prayed God into this event. And I said, okay, I'm going to be here, and I want you to help me see what you want to do. Now that changes my sensibility. If you walk your neighborhood and pray through your neighborhood at night sometime, you're going to start to think about the people living there, who they are, what their stories are. You're going to look for opportunities to meet them. It changes your sensibilities, your places of work, your schools. That would be another practice, I think, that would make us more improvisational in our ability to follow Jesus in ordinary life. There are many of those that I could mention. Those are just a couple.
Yeah, on the other side of the question, and you may feel like you're meddling, but that's okay, because you said you're 71, so meddle away.
Yeah.
Rejecting. What might be some everyday practices we would be rejecting?
Well, by temperament as well as by theology, I abhor Phariseeism. Although it's ironic, Bart, I read the New Testament gospel accounts, and I force myself to read them as if I were a Pharisee. Because that is the party I'd be most likely to identify with. White, reasonably well-to-do, educated, middle class, and a religious leader. That's a really bad formula, by the way. So anything that smacks of legalism, anything that imposes religion from a person of power to a person who doesn't have it, in my mind, is utter anathema. So if I have a lot of money I can give away, and I impose a tithe as part of the life of the church, that's just wrong. That would give you some idea. Legalistic practices are really dangerous to me, and they've snuffed out the heart of Christianity. I'd rather err on the side of license than legalism, although that has its own set of problems.
Yeah, right. Another question, same ilk. Are there examples of contemporary rites of initiation or catechumens that the modern Western church could begin using?
Yeah, actually there is. It's interesting. It's going to, one example is going to come from our Catholic brothers and sisters. In the 1970s, Pope John Paul II, am I right? No, the first, commissioned a study group of bishops and others to develop what they called rites of Christian initiation of adults, RICA. And he commissioned them to look to early Christianity as their model. And scholars produced some fabulous material that I've read because I'm writing and working on this area. And they wanted parishes to have some tools they could adapt in different ways to move adults much more meaningfully into the life of the church in a longer and more deliberate process. This isn't a confirmation. This is for adults. They developed some really good materials, and now other communions are starting to pick up on this cue, and it really has inspired me too to do the same thing.
That's good.
And to think, what I want to do is I want to ask this question: what does a reasonably mature Christian look like? Not a perfect Christian, but what I call a functional Christian. What I mean by that is if I were to hire a detective and put him on your tail for 2 weeks and you didn't know, he'd come back and he'd say, Bart looks functionally Christian all the time. Not perfect. Now you're an athlete. And I was once an athlete. My kids were all athletes. And my 2 boys played AAU basketball. And they were what I would call functional basketball players by the time they were in 7th or 8th grade. That is, put them on a court, they always knew what to do. Now, they could do it better. They could jump higher, shoot better, and lots of things. But they knew all the basic skills you needed. And once a year, their AAU teams would scrimmage the Whitworth varsity team, just for fun. And the varsity guys would always say the same thing. They know what they're doing. So that's what I want to aim for. What does a mature Christian look like? How do you know? If you don't know, then how are you going to help produce that?
Yeah. The shadow side is in this next question about what a mature Christian may not look like. Early church had a formation process, but in that process, what were some of the needed counter formations that Christians needed to not be absorbed by the Roman culture?
Oh, gosh.
And then today, are there parallels to
Oh,
those?
sure. And unfortunately, a lot of the parallels today are religious, Christian even, or ostensibly Christian. Back then, I mean, imagine the mentality they would bring into the Christian church. A transactional view of faith, a syncretistic view of faith. Why can't I have a bunch of gods? Why do I have to just stick with this one God? And so on and so forth. So they had to unlearn a lot of things. But of course, the best way to unlearn something is to learn something else that's better and more formative for them. In our case, it's just a lot of bad religion. Russ Douthat, who writes an opinion piece to the New York Times, wrote a book 10 years ago called Bad Religion. And he said there's a lot of that in American Christianity. And unfortunately, we have a lot of unlearning we have to do of bad habits that people will bring into the church.
Yeah.
But the best way is by forming them in a positive way, as best we can. I mean, I still have bad habits as a child of the 50s and 60s. I'm wearing a sport coat, for Pete's sakes. I mean, what a bad habit.
You look kind of dapper to me.
I don't look, in San Francisco, I look so uncool right now.
I'm not sure that you're wearing it well.
No, thank you.
I love this question, and it harkens back to where you started with respect to what is God growing out of dark spaces or crises in human history. And this has a twist on it because it will cause you to look forward a bit as well. What modern elements are needed for catechism today that might have been unnecessary in earlier centuries? For example, with a dying, polluted planet, I wonder if creation care was ever part of earlier catechisms, or if creation care is a needed innovation in our day. And obviously that ties to
that's a great example. I mean, back then they had racial issues, but they were not black-white as they would be for us today. There were a lot of immigration issues back then because the Roman world was a highly diverse population. So Christians had to figure out how to reach populations that were not part of the dominant group in society. I would say race, though, would be a big one. I would say issues related to women, sexual abuse and other forms of abuse would be really significant today, maybe less so back then. I would say our own understanding of the human person psychologically is much different than it was a long time ago. And we're going to have to figure out how to integrate that into our own formation of Christians. How do we process our own emotions? How do we deal with our past? How do we handle trauma? Those kinds of things. That would all be, I think, much more recent in our development. And that'll have to be integrated in somehow. There are some people writing good stuff on that right now.
Yeah.
Kurt Thompson, for example, is one author who's taking that on. There are some others.
Yes. Excellent. I'm going to ask you two more questions and then ask you to pray for the work in the Bay Area as we conclude. This may come from a closeted Anglican or a closeted Presbyterian, I'm not sure, but do you think there is still value to the Book of Common Prayer?
Oh, gosh.
And how might we use it today?
Yeah, I mean, I quote this verse on occasion, and it's a hack job exegetically, but I still think it works. Jesus said at one point, "Wise is a householder who takes out of his storehouse what is old and what is new." And the Christian movement, because it's a creative movement, is always producing new stuff. We're writing new books, we're writing new music, we're writing new everything. We're creating new stuff. 95% of it is bad. And the window of time, it's going to be gone. I mean, books that we've read today, no one will have heard of 100 years from now, including my own. Because there are very few things that are going to stand the test of time, like Augustine. Charles Wesley wrote over 8,000 hymns. Most of them were bad. But then you've got Love Divine, All Love's Excelling. Oh my gosh. I mean, those 8,000 are worth just that one. And he probably wrote 25 that were great. So in my mind, wise Christians are producing new material and always dusting off the old. But when we dust off the old, we have to be very self-conscious in the way we appropriate it. We can't just assume it, or it becomes rote. So people have to be reintroduced to liturgy and to the practices of the church from different periods of history. And we can't just assume they know it or that it's going to be naturally meaningful to them. Yeah. So I just was in Turkey, with a group, and for first week we were there, we used an Orthodox morning prayer liturgy. I had to explain my head off. I mean, the vocabulary they use, their emphasis on the Virgin Mary, the Theotokos, and so on. Whoa, but it was worth it. And then we sang 3 or 4 hymns from the Orthodox faith, including Let All Mortal Flesh Keep Silent. That's from the third century, the Liturgy of St. James. It's a beautiful hymn. But if we don't explain the language, it'll be lost. Right. So it's reappropriation, I think.
So last question, and then I'd love for you to pray for us. We talked a little bit earlier about the work, gospel movement, creating a gospel ecosystem, whatever you want to call it, in the Bay Area. I've been here 16 years. I've seen probably 3 waves of church planting over those past 16 years. Some churches thriving in the midst of those waves, other churches struggling, some churches having closed their doors. If you could come back in a decade and hope to see some things with respect to a movement in a city like San Francisco in the broader Bay Area, what are you really hoping you would be finding in our churches?
Well, here or Spokane, it applies to all cities. But this one is a little unusual because it's so profoundly secular, The word I'm starting to use more and more is something like a kingdom or gospel saturation, that we think more locally and learn to somehow figure out how to create connections beyond tribal boundaries. I don't even use the word denomination anymore. It's tribal. Whether it's a church planting tribe like Acts 29 or exponential, or it's a denominational or theological. The Gospel Coalition is a tribe, for example. All kinds of these are emerging. And figure out how people can begin thinking about the city as the place that God loves and wants his name to be known. Saturation. And that requires a team. Now, churches are going to play different roles, but if there can be at least some acknowledgement of the significance of other churches and traditions besides their own. I know a lot of pastors in Spokane, and I'd say about maybe 60% are open to some notion of a kingdom saturation. And as that gets started and begins to grow, including church planning, and then people who are on the front lines, people who are 1 or 2 steps back but are willing to support it by giving money or whatever it happens to be, that creates its own momentum, and I think the movement will grow.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Well, I want to, again, thank you personally, where I started with my introduction, for writing a book on grief that gave my wife and I hope in the midst of some of our own pain. And then thank you collectively for just sharing your wisdom. You've written masterfully on how to take formation and discipleship into the next 10 to 20 years. And I'm super grateful. And I'm hoping you might just pray for us as we do ministry in the Bay Area, and that'll conclude our time.
Okay, I do want to say I have developed a new catechumenate, and if anybody in your network wants to learn more, they can get their name to you and email address, and I can send them some information.
I was looking at it this afternoon. So.
Okay, let's pray. Our God, thank you that you are the Lord of this world. In fact, you're the Lord of the universe. You're its creator. You're its caretaker. You're its redeemer. We want to serve you in everything we do. Bless the Christian movement in this city. Encourage pastors who are discouraged and tired and depressed in some cases and unsure of the future of their church. Help them to find you in this.